1, 2, 3.
The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
For how long can you pay attention, really? When was the last time you ignored your phone and all the apps on it and fell into an uninterrupted state of flow? Studies have shown that U.S. teens can only focus on a task for a little over a minute. And adults in the workplace, we're not much better at a 3-minute average. And yet, says today's guest, democracy requires a population to have the ability to pay attention long enough to identify real problems, distinguish them from fantasies, come up with solutions, and hold their leaders accountable. Lose that, he says, and we lose our ability to have a fully functioning society. Yikes! If time is what we have as a measurement for our lives lived, then how we spend time and for what purpose really matters. In his latest book, New York Times bestselling author Johann Hari says it's virtually impossible to have a normal brain today because we are all victims of attention theft. It's not our fault, but there are things we can do. Johann's book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again, was on a whole lot of lists of best books of 2022. Amazon named it one of 3. It is just out this month in paperback. We last talked to him about his book on the war on drugs called Chasing the Scream. I am very happy to welcome Johann Hari back to the program. Welcome, Johann. Glad to have you.
Hooray. I'm so happy to be with you, Laura. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so break it to me gently. I have just been on a 10-day break, right? And during that period, I felt my stress decrease, my calm increase. I actually managed to read an entire 800-page book. Getting COVID again and not being able to see anybody helped. A snowstorm helped. But boy, I feel great. What is about to happen? You've looked at the science.
Well, I wanted to answer this for myself because, the reason I wrote the book is because every year that passed, things that require deep focus that are so important to me, like reading books, having proper long conversations, watching films, were getting more and more like running up a down escalator. Do you know what I mean? I could still do it, but it was getting harder and harder. And like you say, I could see this was happening to huge numbers of people around me. For every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. So I wanted to understand what's happening to us, right? Exactly. What's going to hit Laura? And
I start to re-engage.
So I went on this big journey all over the world, from Moscow to Miami to Melbourne, to use my training in the social sciences at Cambridge University to do a really deep dig into this and to meet over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus, people who study different aspects of it. And what I learned is the answer to your question is quite surprising. There's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make your attention worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been hugely rising in recent years. So I'll give you an example of one of the causes that I think is about to hit you, Laura. And then we could talk about what we can do about it and how actually I'm actually quite optimistic about this in many ways. I went to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, an amazing man named Professor Earl Miller. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you've got to understand about the human brain more than anything else. You can only consciously think about 1 or 2 things at a time. That's it. This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not changed significantly in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any timescale we're going to see. You can only think about 1 or 2 things at a time. But what's happened is we've fallen for a kind of mass delusion. The average teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time, and the rest of us are not very far behind them. So what happens is scientists like Professor Miller and scientists all over the world get people into labs, younger people, older people, and they get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time, and they monitor them. And what they discover is always the same. You can't do more than one thing at a time. What you do is you juggle very rapidly between tasks. You're like, wait, what did Laura just ask me? What does it say on WhatsApp? What does it say on the TV there about the speaker? Wait, what did Laura just ask me again? So we're constantly juggling. And it turns out that juggling comes with a really big cost. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect. When you try and do more than one thing at a time, you do all the things you're trying to do much less competently. you make more
So what I'm
mistakes.
hearing is women who have been told for decades that we could multitask, have it all, have kids, do everything else and a career. We've been saying that was impossible for years. It's actually true. It's a myth.
It's one of the other patriarchal myths that's been used to keep women down, I'm afraid. Exactly. And I mean, the evidence is really striking on this. It's not just that you make more mistakes. You remember much less of what you do when you're switching rapidly between tasks. You're much less creative. And this sounds like a small thing when you first hear it. In fact, one small study found being constantly interrupted is twice as bad for your intelligence and attention in the short term as getting stoned. I mean, this is a really big effect. It's why Professor Miller says we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of being constantly interrupted. That's one of the 12 causes. Many of the other causes are actually things I've never even thought about. But I think as you come back into this environment, you're going to be interrupted a lot more. There's a study that found if you're interrupted by something as simple as a text message, it takes you on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you have.
And whoever has 23 minutes, right? I know what you're going to tell me next.
If you were trying to read that 800-page book while simultaneously being constantly interrupted and pulled away, you're not able to give it your full attention.
So one of the things that strikes me from your book, and the book is packed with studies, I encourage people to check it out, is what you say about how lack of attention affects democracy, and how in particular lack of attention or the ability to focus predisposes people to embrace sort of simplistic authoritarian solutions. Can you elaborate on that and what you found around that? Because you say it's no coincidence that all this is happening to our attention at the same time as our democracy seems to be in trouble.
There's so many layers to the attention crisis. And when I started looking at this, at first you think about attention problems. You think, oh, I went to the fridge to get a Diet Coke. I got a text from my friend. I replied. I came back to my laptop. I didn't have my Diet Coke. We think of it as this constant low-level distraction, which is having profound effects on us and our children and our ability to think clearly. But the deeper you look into this subject, the more you discover that it's actually having profoundly deleterious effects, not just at an individual level, not just for us and our children, but actually for our whole society, for our democracy. And I think it's worth thinking about one of the mechanisms why, and it takes a bit of time to unpack, but I think it really helped me to understand some of the things that have been happening in your country and mine that perhaps have been a bit mysterious about why they're happening. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley with people who designed key aspects of the world in which we now live. They are sick with guilt at what they've done, a lot of them, by the way. And they explained to me, anyone watching, please don't, but if you open Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram now, and you begin to scroll, those companies immediately begin to make money out of you in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see ads. Okay, you don't need me to tell you about that. Second way is much more important. Everything you do on these apps is scanned and sorted by their artificial intelligence algorithms to learn who you are. They're harvesting information about you, and they're gathering this information for one reason in particular. They want to keep you scrolling because the longer you scroll, the more ads you see, the more money they make. And every time you close the app or your kids close the app, that revenue stream disappears. So all of this genius, all of these algorithms in Silicon Valley are geared when it comes to social media to one thing and one thing only, figuring out how do we get Laura to pick up her phone as often as possible, open the app as often as possible, and scroll as long as possible. That's it. That's their business model. And they are unbelievably good at it. So they're constantly figuring out techniques that do this. And this led to a political effect that was not their intention. To be fair to them, it was not their intention. And this led to a political effect that no one intended, right? The algorithms are scanning all of us. They're figuring out, okay, what keeps Laura scrolling? What keeps Johann scrolling? What keeps everyone watching scrolling? And the algorithms bumped into an underlying truth about human psychology. It's been known about for 90 years now. It's called negativity bias. It's very simple. Human beings will stare longer at things that make them angry or upset than they will at things that make us feel good. If you've ever seen a car crash on the highway, you know exactly what I mean. You stared longer at the mangled car wreck than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the street. This is very deep in human psychology. 10-week-old babies will stare longer at an angry face than a smiling face. But when this combines with algorithms that we're exposed to for 3-4 hours a day, designed to keep us scrolling, it has a horrendous effect. So imagine two girls who go to the same party and leave to go home on the same bus. And one of them does a video saying, you know, what a lovely party. We danced to Ariana Grande. We had such fun. I loved it. And the other girl does a video where she says, Karen, who hosted the party, was an absolute skank and does just an angry denunciation of all the people at the party. The
Yeah, I know what's
algorithms
going
are
on.
scanning for the kind of language you use, and it'll put the first video into a few people's speeds, but it'll put the second video into far more people's speeds, because if it's enraging, it's engaging. People go, what do you mean Karen's a skank? How dare? It'll start a fight that keeps people scrolling in a way that just hearing something nice doesn't.
Well, it's very interesting, though, what you're saying, because you're not simply blaming the technology. We'll get to that, but you're blaming a function of it. Like those algorithms can be set up in all sorts of ways. So as you think about what can be done about any of this, and Shoshana Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism, you quoted in the book, is chilling. And we've seen the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we've gotten a sense of what some of these problems are. But it is possible, ideally, to redesign those algorithms, isn't it?
Well, this is one of the reasons I'm profoundly optimistic. The way big tech want us to frame this debate, and I would stress that tech is one of the 12 factors harming our attention. There's lots of other things going on. But when it comes to this factor, big tech wants us to frame this as, are you pro-tech or are you anti-tech?
Right.
And you hear that, you're like, well, I'm not going to go off and join the Amish. I guess I must be pro-tech. No disrespect to the Amish. If they're watching, you are cheating. I'm not going to join the Amish. I guess I'm pro-tech. That's not the debate. We're all pro-tech. The debate is, everyone loves technology. There's loads of great things about our technology. The debate isn't, are you pro-tech or anti-tech? The debate is, what tech, working in whose interests, designed for what goals? We can have all the technology we currently have, but have it not designed to have this effect on us. And just to tease out a little bit more about the democracy element, if that's okay, Laura. So this effect, the nice people are muffled, the angriest people are amplified. That is bad enough for two teenage girls on a bus. We all know what's happened to teenage girls' mental health. But imagine that applied to a whole country, except you don't have to imagine it, because we're living it, right? We've been living it for more than 10 years now. I mean, when Jair Bolsonaro, the fascist, and it's not a word I use lightly, who won the Brazilian presidential election, fortunately just defeated by a hair's breadth.
Now living in Florida.
So he had been a washed up, forgotten far-right senator until the algorithms picked him up, began amplifying him. And the night he won, his supporters at his election rally chanted, Facebook, 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 because they knew why they were there. So there's many reasons why we've got to deal with this attention crisis. I would say to anyone watching, at a personal level, just think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's, starting a business, being a good parent, being part of a campaign group, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is, that thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And when attention and focus break down, your ability to achieve your goals and solve your problems breaks down. That's true for individuals, and that's true of wider societies. We've got so many crises we need to deal with that require sustained focus and attention on the part of the citizenry. Now, we can get back to that, but we have to first acknowledge what's gone wrong.
Well, the other thing I want us to acknowledge is there might be a reason we want to distract ourselves. And I'm hearing everything you say. You use the word stolen. We're not just giving our attention away, although I'd love you to elaborate on the degree to which we are responsible. But I do want you also to ask yourself, possibly, what is it we want to distract ourselves from?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of unhappiness, loneliness, people being controlled and humiliated at work in our society.
Do you think that's part of the problem?
Of course. I mean, as with, the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. That's true if we're talking about opioids, and that's true if we're talking about addiction to scrolling on your phone. So absolutely, whereas society becomes intolerable for people, and many people's lives are intolerable in our current societies, are needlessly painful, of course, you have to deal with that underlying pain. And we need to do both, of course, because where you deal with the underlying pain, you free people up in order to, restore their attention. And where you help restore attention, you free people up to begin to solve these deeper problems. So you've absolutely got to deal with both.
So talk a bit about whether you see any models out there that could be working. I mean, you have your guy, Tim Miller, in Silicon Valley saying, we could create technology that would create greater states of calm and reduce stress. We don't, but we could. Any evidence that anybody is out there working on that?
100%. I went to lots of places that are doing it, but and I'll talk about it in a second, but I would say with all of the 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, and they range very widely from the food we eat, to the way our kids' schools currently work, to the way our employment currently works. So it's a very broad range of things. But for all of these factors, there's, I think, two levels at which we've got to tackle them. I think of them as defense and offense. There are loads of things that we can do to defend ourselves and our children at an individual level. I'll give you an example of one. I feel a bit like a QVC person here, but I won't plug the brand. This here is a K-safe. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn the dial, push the button, and it will lock your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day.
And how many times have you tried to crack it open?
You can. I mean, you can actually. I know this from a previous one. You can actually just kick it open, but then it breaks, and you have to buy another one, and they're like $70. You don't want to do that. So if there was an emergency, you can break it. But I won't sit down to watch a film with my partner unless we both put our phones in the phone jail. I won't have my friends around for dinner unless we all imprison our phones. I use it 3 hours a day to work. I go through dozens of things in the book that people can do immediately to protect themselves and their children. And a lot of the book is about our kids as well. But I want to really level with people because I do not think most books about attention are being honest with people. I am passionately in favor of these individual changes. They're really important. On their own, they're not going to solve the problem. Because at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us all day.
Right.
And then leaning forward and going, hey, buddy, you should learn to meditate. Then you wouldn't scratch so much. And you want to go, to hell with you. I'll learn to meditate. That's really valuable. You need to stop pouring this damn itching powder on me. So and I'll give you a concrete, that can sound a bit fancy. Okay, how do we do that? Give you an example of a place that I went to that did it. There's lots of places that have taken steps to this, but I'll give you an example of one. In France in 2018, they had a huge crisis of what they called le burnout, which I don't think I need to translate. And the French government, under pressure from labour unions, they would never have done it without that pressure, set up an inquiry to figure out why is everyone so burned out these days. And they discovered one crucial factor. 40% of French workers felt they could never stop checking their phone or email while they were awake because their boss could message them at any time of the day or night. And if they didn't answer, they'd be in trouble. So I can give those people all the lovely self-help advice in the world, right? They can't do it. If they're going to lose their jobs if they do it, they can't do it. So it required a collective solution, which the French government, again under pressure from labour unions, introduced. It's very simple. Every French worker, by law, has what's called a right to disconnect. It just says your work hours have to be stipulated in your contract. And when your work hours are over, unless they're paying you overtime, you don't have to answer your phone, you don't have to check your email. When I was in Paris, a Rentokil, the pest control company, was fined 70,000 euros for complaining that one of their workers hadn't replied to his email an hour after he left work. Now, you can see how that's a collective solution. We can't do that on our own. You can't go to your boss and go, I'm just not answering emails after I leave work anymore, unless you're a very powerful person in your workplace. But together we can assert that, right? And that's had a really profound effect on restoring people's attention in France. There's lots of things like that. What you've got to do is identify the underlying problem. What's the underlying problem there? We're really stressed. Right. You know, I don't remember my parents ever being called by their boss after they came home. It was unheard of. The only people who did that were the president and doctors. And even doctors, they had like set times, right? So you go from almost nobody being in that position to being on call to, you know, almost half of us being on call all the time. That stresses us, it burns us out. And this goes to a really important shift in psychology I think we need. You know, when I started researching the book, I just thought, well, the reason I can't pay attention is obvious. There's something wrong with me. My willpower isn't strong enough. You know, the most important thing I can communicate to people is if you're struggling to focus and pay attention, or your kids are struggling to focus and pay attention, this is not your fault. There's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with our children. There's something wrong with the way we're living.
And you do, I mean, you said that there are 12 aspects and we've only touched on a few of them. Some of the others are, you know, the food we eat and the way that we exercise or don't, the way that we're raising our kids, etc. The list is long, not to mention pollution of the environment, etc. It's a complicated web of mess. And I wonder the degree to which you think your book is having an effect. Are you hearing from governments, from legislators, from people who are trying to address these sort of interconnected issues?
It's been very moving to see how much people are responding to the book, and a crazy mixture of people have been responding to the book. I think I've written the only book that has ever been praised by both Hillary Clinton and Tucker Carlson, for example, which is not where I ever expected to be in life, but okay, I'll take it. But I think people can see something is really wrong here. And there's a tremendous hunger to deal with this. And also, I think the most important thing, again, related to what I've just been saying, is about approaching this in a spirit of optimism.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you hear about how big these structural causes are, we're in a huge attention crisis, and we're in that crisis because of big structural forces. There can be a moment I felt of going, oh, it's like we're trapped in the matrix. But then you begin to realize these are very recent changes. Dr. James Williams, who had been at the heart of Silicon Valley, felt sick with guilt about what they were doing, quit, and became, I would argue, the most important philosopher of attention in the world, said to me, the axe existed for 1.4 million years before anyone said, guys, should we put a handle on this thing? The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. We can fix these things. All of these factors, the food industry, these are things that we can fix if we want to. And again, I know that can sound, we're at a time of political paralysis and profound pessimism for perfectly good reasons. I want to give it, if it's okay, I'll give an example of something that you'll remember, Laura, I remember from my childhood, that I think is a really interesting model for what we need to do now, in addition to the dozens of personal things that I write about. You'll remember when we were young, the dominant form of gasoline by far in the United States and Britain and all over the world was leaded gasoline. And it was discovered by scientists that exposure to lead is really bad for your brain, and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention. And if it's in gasoline, obviously it gets into the air. Everyone was breathing in really extraordinarily high levels amount of lead. And so what happened is, in the late 1970s, a group of ordinary moms, what were called housewives at the time, banded together and said, well, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing this for-profit industry to screw up our kids' brains? And it's really important to notice what they didn't say. They didn't say, so let's ban gasoline, right? Just like none of us are saying, let's dispense with technology. What they said is, let's get rid of leaded gasoline and transfer to safer forms, right? Force our society to transfer to safer forms. And it followed the classic pattern of all political fights that Gandhi described. First, they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. As everyone watching knows, there's no more leaded gasoline almost anywhere in the world now. And as a result, the Center for Disease Control says the average American child is 3 to 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had those moms not made that fight and not fought like hell for their children. Now, to me, that's a really good model. You've got the individual defense and loads of things we can do. And then you've got these moms, ordinary democratic citizens who understood the science and fought to get the contaminant out of the environment. Now, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley saying, well, is there an equivalent to the lead in the lead paint in our technology? There is, and I talk about what it is in the book. But there's also, in all of these factors, whether it's food, the way our schools work, the way our offices work, there are specific elements that the science shows very clearly are trashing our attention, but they're not inherent to the model, right? You can have petrol without lead in it. You can have technology that isn't designed to maximally hack and invade our attention. In fact, we can have it designed to help and aid our attention if we wanted to. Technology exists to do that tomorrow if the incentives are right. For all of these factors, we can put them right if we want to.
Do you think more of us working from home will make things better or worse?
It's not clear. It's not clear. So we know that loneliness massively increases attention problems. People become more vigilant when they're lonely. Working from home can increase loneliness. On the other hand, we know that when people have more control over their time, they're less stressed. We know that stress ruins attention and focus. So it's complicated. And I think it will vary actually from workplace to workplace, depending on how much freedom people are given. It's not totally clear. I do think, though, as our friend Naomi Klein said, if interacting through screens met our deeper social needs, we would all have been fine for the last 2 years, right? Instead, I never once heard anyone say in the last 2 years the sentence, hooray, another Zoom call, right? So what it tells us is there's something about screen-based, of course, there's many good things about screen-based interaction, but it tells us also there's something about it that doesn't meet our needs to be seen and heard. You and I have met, Laura. I don't feel like we're really meeting now. We're having an interesting chat, but I don't feel like I did when we sat opposite each other and looked into each other.
No, I miss having people in the studio and sitting with them close, which is why I think, being at home, possibly where you're surrounded by, other humans or maybe animal companions, adds an element of reality to your life that we've been losing as we spend more and more time in our screens. But the office used to provide some of that. You have interesting stuff to say about how office design doesn't help our focus. We could obviously talk for a very long time. But I do want to ask you about the connections between this book and your last two books, and in fact, social connections, because I think we can do all sorts of things. And the Biden administration is poised possibly to use antitrust legislation. There's support from right and left to try to address the monopoly aspect of some of these huge tech platforms, and I'm all for it. But I also think there's an element on us to talk to people, to actually reconnect in our lives. And yet, I think people are still a little loath to. Broadway's suffering, theater's suffering. People are not going to sit in rooms with other people. We're in a profound moment of choice making. And I guess you're watching, I'm watching. But where's your curiosity taking you now?
It's interesting you say that. As you say that, I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's outside Spokane in Washington State. It's funny, I arrived, I got out, it's a clearing in the woods. It's kind of wooden huts in the woods. And absolutely instinctively, with no irony, the first thing I did was glance at my phone and feel really irritated. I had no cell phone reception. I was like, oh, wait, you're in the right place. But it was fascinating spending time with the young men there. They get all kinds of people there, but they disproportionately get young men who've become obsessed with online multiplayer role-playing games. Like, it was World of Warcraft when I was there, but it'd be Fortnite now. And I had such an interesting conversation with the brilliant people who run that center. I remember them saying to me, you've got to ask yourself, this is before COVID, you've got to ask yourself, what are these video games, and actually pornography in the case of a lot of the young men, what are they getting out of these games, right? They're doing it because they're getting something out of it. And what they're getting is in some ways a kind of simulacrum of the things we've lost. We've become a much lonelier society. But when you're online, at least someone's seeing you play. At least you're in some kind of conversation. They get a sense that they're good at something. We have an education system that particularly makes young men feel they are incompetent, not good at anything. They get a sense that they're moving around. Our young people never, even before COVID, by historical standards, only 10% of American children before COVID ever played outside without an adult. They get a sense they're moving around. But in a way, what they're getting is a kind of parody of those things. And I think this is really relevant to our moment now. Yeah. It was very revealing to me that a lot of them were obsessed with both with online role-playing games and have become completely addicted to pornography, because in a way, I think the relationship between social media and social life, even social media that's designed well, which ours is not, is a bit like the relationship between pornography and sex, right? I'm not completely against pornography, but if your entire sex life consisted of looking at pornography, you'd be kind of irritable a lot of the time, because we did not evolve to look at pornography. We evolved to have sex. And in a similar way, we did not evolve to stare into each other's, we didn't evolve to look at each other through the little green dot that I'm looking at you at now. We evolved to interact in three-dimensional space. Right. And the failure to do that, the flattening of that, leaves us feeling unfulfilled in the same way that pornography, if it's all your sex life is, leaves you feeling unfulfilled. So I think the lesson that I learned at Restart Washington was really important. And I'm really glad you teased this out, because most people don't ask me about this. There's a very complex interaction between a profoundly lonely society, a society where people are taught that life is all about money and status, a society where people are controlled and humiliated at work, and people then not wanting to be present in their lives, right? And I think COVID has been primarily a horrendous tragedy for the million Americans who've died and the people who've died all over the world. It's also given us relief from some of the things that were making us feel bad, and accelerated some of the other things that are making us feel bad. It's a complex mixture. So I think we need to think about it in a complex way. But I hope we can learn, at least from COVID, some of the things. What Naomi Klein argues, I think brilliantly, is COVID gave us a taste of where we were meant to be 15 years from now, where everything was going to be done on screens, right? It's given us a taste of the future to which we were headed. She calls it the Screen New Deal, right? And is that where we want to be?
Right.
Do we look back on the last 2 years and go, what a great time we had?
Yeah, well, I think it's It's in the complexity that the richness lies. I mean, we talked a few weeks ago on this program with Leah Lakshmi, a disability justice activist, who talked about the positives that had come out of this period, particularly for people who had been living in isolation as disabled people, and how the technology in some ways has helped, and how she hopes people will actually continue to make webinars and meetings available in a virtual way for those who can't get there in person, and make the in-person events more accessible. It's all one big mix.
I think that's absolutely true. But the way I think about it, the way I came to think about it after going on this big journey for Stolen Focus was, the way I think about it is we're in a race, right? On the one side, you've got these 12 factors that I write about that are undermining our focus and attention, many of which are poised to become more powerful. Yeah. Paul Graham, one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, said the world will be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is than Facebook. Now imagine the next crack-like iteration of Facebook in the metaverse. That's one side of the race. On the other side of the race, I would argue there's got to be a movement of all of us saying, no. Yeah. No, you don't get to do that to us. You don't get to do that to my mind. You don't get to do that to my child. No, that is not a good life. No, we choose a life where, of course, we have technology and we have speed and we have all sorts of things, but also where we have the option for depth, where we can think deeply, where our children can play outside, where we can read books. But to get there, it requires this shift in psychology. We need to stop blaming ourselves. We need to stop blaming our children. We need to stop asking only for small individual tweaks, hugely valuable though they are. We need to realize, we are not medieval peasants begging at the court of King Zuckerberg for a few little crumbs of attention from his table. We are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds. And if we follow the scientific evidence, we can take our minds back if we want to.
So the AI image and chat creations that we're seeing come online right now in tremendous number, everything from chatbots to Deep Dream, all those kinds of things. Do we just say no? I mean, is there a moment where we just say no?
No, definitely not. No, there's loads of great things about those technologies. I mean, AI is going to uncover all sorts of profoundly liberating things for humanity if we get it right. So it's not a kind of Luddite no to technology. What we want is A, technology that works for us, not against us. You can only get that with regulation. And B, some life where you're not constantly enthralled to technology. But, there's a really interesting, Professor Suna Lehman in Copenhagen is an amazing man who did the first ever study that proved that our collective attention really is shrinking. And just by coincidence, the day I interviewed him in Copenhagen, the day before, a couple of days before, a photograph had been released. A lot of people watching will have seen it. It's an image of Mark Zuckerberg, and it's when they unveiled the Oculus virtual reality headsets. And the entire audience of, I think, thousands of people is wearing these VR headsets. And Mark Zuckerberg is the only person not wearing a VR headset. And Professor Lehman said to me, that's a vision of one potential future for us, right? You'll have an elite who don't use this stuff. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't let his children even have an iPad, right? They send their kids to Montessori, not the elite in Silicon Valley, not just Zuckerberg, send their kids to Montessori schools. They go on long meditation retreats. They work very hard to protect their attention, and they increasingly degrade and manipulate the wider population's attention. Now, I don't think we'll get to that, because I think we'll push back, because I think there's enough people like me. I wrote the book. The thing that really spurred me to write the book, along with concerns about myself, was a young person in my life, my godson, who was in a terrible state. He spent almost all his waking hours alternating between his iPad, his laptop, and his iPhone. And it was almost like he was kind of whirring at the speed of Snapchat, and nothing still or serious could touch him. And actually it was looking at him that made me think, I need to find out what's going on here, right? And he didn't think it was a good way to live, and I didn't. I think there's enough people like me who don't want to live in a society where, as you said in the intro, the average American office worker now focuses on only one task for only 3 minutes. And as Professor Gloria Mark has shown, that figure is rapidly declining. In fact, she says it's down to about 45 seconds now. That is not a good society. Right. No one thinks that's a good society. That's not a good society for us as individuals. It's also, we are not going to solve the climate crisis if we can only think in 45-second bursts, right? To go back to the way you framed this right at the start, Laura, which I thought was so thoughtful and important. One of my earliest political memories, in fact, really the first political crisis I remember was the ozone layer crisis,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you think about the ozone layer crisis, what happened? For younger people who don't know, there's a layer of ozone that protects the earth from the sun's rays. And in the 80s, we were releasing a chemical called CFCs that was in hairsprays, and we loved our hairsprays in the 80s. And it was causing a hole in the ozone layer, and it was potentially going to melt the Arctic. And I remember being terrified of this when I was a child. But what happened? Ordinary citizens absorbed the science. They distinguished it from nonsense. And then they organized and pressured their governments in places as different as Margaret Thatcher's Britain and Mikhail Gorbachev's Soviet Union. They pressured their governments to ban CFCs. They did it. It worked. Now the ozone layer is healing. It's almost healed, right? I don't think anyone listening thinks that would happen today, right? If the ozone layer crisis happened now, I think you'd have a load of people saying, how do we even know the ozone layer exists? Right. Maybe George Soros made the hole in the ozone layer. We would just be lost in garbage and artificial polarization. So,
because that keeps us hooked.
Exactly. We've got to get our attention back for the sake of ourselves and our children and for the sake of democracy. You know, we're speaking shortly after the Brazilian election where President Lula da Silva was, thank God, re-elected, but it was a hair's breadth. We nearly just lost democracy in one of the biggest democracies in the world. It came very close, right? American viewers don't need me to tell them about the parallels at home, right? My country is having its own terrible, as you can tell, I am from Downton Abbey, these massive crises. You know, we have got to deal with these problems, and I'm really optimistic that we can.
Well, that's what I want you to. That's what I want you to address at the end of this conversation. And we always ask our guests, you know, what do they think the story will be that the future tells of this moment? You know, 25, 50 years from now, what do you think the story will be? And before we get to that, while you ponder that, I just have to note that you are writing a biography of perhaps the greatest example of focus that I can think of, focused thinking, and that's Noam Chomsky. And the popularity of Noam Chomsky's speeches, texts, interviews also gives me hope and confidence that people do want to be exposed to somebody following a train of thought that can take them over, you know, centuries with one fairly long series of paragraphs and get somewhere. We do want it, I think. We just don't really know where to find it necessarily. So I don't know how you want to address those two things I've posed at you, but one story of the future and the other Chomsky. Why Chomsky? Is it your antidote to this crisis?
Well, I think we crave depth, and there is no deeper thinker than Noam Chomsky. You know, I think in the academic citation index, he's between Plato and Einstein, right? What incredible good fortune we have that the cleverest person of our age is also such a fundamentally good person who has used that ferocious intellectual power to help so many people and to be on the side of the most oppressed people in the world. So the main reason I wrote this biography of Noam, and I've been working on it for 12 years now. I'll be older than Noam is now by the time I finish, and he's 94, but because his life is incredibly complex, and you have to think about so many different things. But the main reason I wanted to work on it is because I just think it's such an incredible story, right? Just journalistically, how did this guy become who he is? Like, what a wild tale. And the more you look at it, the more extraordinary the story is, actually. So that was why I wrote that, and it is an incredible example of depth. He's a person who can think in a staggering, I mean, he's almost superhuman in his capacity to do that. That's not really a very realistic model for the rest of us. We can't. I don't want to say to people, get your focus back and you'll be Chomsky. That would not be a realistic aspiration, but we can be, you know, a few steps closer to him. In terms of the future, I think it really, it's a very Chomskyan formulation, but it very much depends on what we do now, right? It is possible that they will look back and go, look, they had these very deep factors that caused them to really suffer when it came to attention and focus. By the way, we can look back on lead and say that, right? Mm-hmm. They go, oh, look, they were exposed to all these things that scientists knew screw up your ability to pay attention. And they sorted it out. You know, I'm not saying the future will be magical, but they came to understand those things and they dealt with them in an intelligent, pragmatic way. And look, now we can think more deeply. That's one option. Another option is they'll look back nostalgically on the time when people had a whole 45 seconds per task in an office, right? It entirely depends on us. The solutions are there. I've seen them in practice from places as different as France and New Zealand, right? These are not science fiction creations. They're real places. The solutions are there if we want to pursue them. But, you don't get what you don't fight for. I mean, non-violently fight for, of course. And the truth is we have to decide, do we value attention?
Yeah.
Do we want our children to be able to read books and think deeply? Do we want that for ourselves? Do we value it more than the next crappy update on your phone and the next, exposure to a lot of the other things that I talk about? And that's a choice we have to make, right? Now, we're not making it in a context of our own choosing. Your book is called Stolen Focus because your attention didn't collapse. Your attention's been stolen from you by these big forces. You didn't choose any of this, but together we can deal with it. Rebecca Solnit, who I'm pretty sure a wonderful writer, says, politicians are weather vanes. It's our job to be the weather, right? No one's coming to rescue us. Just like the lead industry was not going to go one day, you know what, guys? I think we've made enough money. Let's stop poisoning kids' brains, right? That's not how change happens. They had to be made to do it, and had it with incredible results for all of us. So we've got to make these forces change. But the advantage is this is a crisis that everyone is experiencing, almost everyone. It's a very rare person who says they're happy with their attention these days. And if all the fire alarms are going off, that tells you something, right?
All right. Johann Hari's book is Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again. He's calling on us to act, and I thank you so much for joining me on the show, Johann. It's fantastic to have you back.
What a pleasure. What great questions. Thanks so much, Laura. Cheers.
You're so welcome.